Ciao, and welcome to the second episode of our Perspectives series. So I'm Luna, and I'm Italian, and we have my boyfriend Nick from California. Ciao, Nick.
Ciao.
And then we have our friend and special guest Liz from the UK. Hi, Liz.
Hi, ciao a tutti.
So the topic today is voting. And we want just to say that we will probably not be 100% accurate. We will just share our own experiences of voting in different countries. And also, we will not get into politics at all. We will just talk about the experience of voting. So with that said, Nick, what's the first question?
Okay, so I guess I'm leading the discussion here. And I think this is interesting, and I was very curious myself, the question of how you registered to vote. And I think I would also rephrase this as, did you register to vote? In the United States, everybody is required to register. Even if you're a citizen, you cannot vote until you've registered. Is that the case in the UK?
Yeah, it is. Once you're 16, you receive a letter, and once you've received the letter, it's mandatory to get on the electoral roll. So I've registered to vote. I don't know how many times. I think I probably did it initially via, filled in a paper form, and then I've registered every time I've moved house, which is quite a lot when you're a student.
Okay.
And then early years in London. So now you can do it online, and it's relatively simple. But yeah, you will receive a hefty fine if you do not register to vote, is my understanding.
So registering is mandatory?
Mm-hmm. Voting is not, but registering is.
Okay, Interesting. And that inspires other questions that I think we'll get to. Now, you said you've registered multiple times, but only because you've moved residences. You don't have to register separately for each election.
No. Once you're on the electoral roll, so like my parents will have done it once 30 years ago when they moved into the house that they're in. But I've moved kind of on average once every 18 months. So,
which sounds very similar to the United States, except for the mandatory aspect. Luna,
okay.
Do people have to register to vote in Italy?
No, because it's automatic. So once you turn 18, you receive a communication, which I guess now it's an email. I received a letter, and I had to physically go to the electoral office to collect my electoral card, which means that I'm a registered voter and I get a stamp every time I vote. But that's completely automatic once you turn 18.
You get a stamp?
Yeah, I do.
I love it.
Like
I love it
too. Yeah, and that is true for all Italian citizens, no matter where they live. So even if they live abroad, they get registered automatically. And every time you change address, you automatically get the new address registered, like for the mail and everything else, and you get a sticker that you stick here with the new address on your electoral card, and that's all. And if you don't receive, for some reasons or issues, your electoral card, you can go even up to the day of the voting and the day of the election to collect it to the electoral office. So it's very, very easy to be registered.
And that's interesting because this is one of the many topics of much debate in the US, is that there are strategies, techniques for certain political parties to prevent other people from voting, voter suppression. They may have an advantage in the election if certain people do not vote. And there's an argument that requiring people to register is a form of suppression. Why are they not automatically registered? That's interesting that in the UK it's mandatory. It seems like in Italy and the UK, the policy is that everybody should be lined up to vote. But in the United States, far too often it's, let's see if we can prevent certain people from voting. And that's often a problem.
So it's mandatory in the UK, but in advance of every single election, there is a massive kind of drive of register to vote. So it's mandatory, but not I don't know the figures, but not everyone is registered. So I think similarly, it creates a second level barrier because first of all, you've got to organize yourself, find out where the form is, potentially go to an office, maybe demonstrate something about your proof of residency. So there is a kind of additional step before you can't just turn up on the day.
So the idea that it may be mandatory to register suggests that there might be a consequence if you do not. register? Is there?
There is. It's a fine, and I don't know the exact figure, but it's in my kind of recollection, it's a pretty hefty fine. Like it was a motivator enough for me. But I don't think that's particularly well kind of advertised. I have been looking into it and have had to register on that website quite a few times, so I'm well aware of it. But anyone who isn't registered probably isn't aware of those consequences.
Okay. Do you know how well they're enforced?
I don't know how well that's enforced, but I do know that I've definitely received chasing letters. If maybe one part of the system knows that I live in a different address, but I haven't got around to registering yet, I've received a letter to kind of prompt me to vote. So,
which makes me wonder, like, if a part of the system is aware, why are you not automatically updated?
Absolutely.
A valid question. And Luna, I'd like to slide in an extra question that's not on your list, but I think it's relevant at this point. In Italy, are convicted felons allowed to vote? Are they automatically registered, etc.?
That's a great question that I don't know the answer to exactly.
Sure.
I know that there are some felonies that prevent you to vote, like that take away your right to vote. And among these are bankruptcy, like felon bankruptcy, and fraud. But I don't know the specifics of when you lose your right to vote. But I know that in some cases you can lose your right to vote, for sure.
In the United States, like so many things, it's not actually governed by the government of the United States on the federal level. It's determined by the states. And it's my understanding that generally convicted felons are not allowed to vote, but there are some places where there are, and a lot of initiatives trying to push for giving somebody who's been convicted, who's served their sentence, who has now been released, returning their right to vote, based on the idea that they have paid whatever debt that has been levied against them, give them back their right. I think it's interesting. In the UK,
I don't know.
Does that affect?
I remember going to a debate about this, but I don't know. I don't know the answer.
And I think that alone is interesting. It's perfectly reasonable to not know some of these things. And I think that if you don't know, means that it has not become such a hot button issue like it has in other places. So, even knowing that it's not an issue. Which is acceptable as well. You're not expected to know everything, every detail. So now we should talk about how the actual process of the vote works. Luna, do you vote in person, or have you voted in person?
Yes, I've always voted only in person, and basically what I do is I take my card and my national ID. I go to the polling place that is written on the electoral card, because every person has a specific polling place that they have to go to. And just to give you an idea, like, the voting day is always a Sunday. And if it's a big election, it's a Sunday and a Monday following that day, from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. on the Sunday, from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. on the Monday. Just to give you an idea, I live 500 meters from my aunt, which is a third of a mile for our American friends. And we go to different polling places because we live way too far away from each other. So every school is usually a polling place. And I just go there. Even with the COVID measures, there wasn't much difference. Like, you just enter the place. There are several classrooms that are dedicated to different sections, as they're called. So I have my specific section that I have to go to. There are two tables, one for men and one for women, which is a controversial point of debate in this period, because, of course, some folks don't identify with either one. So you go there, you present your document and your electoral card. They confirm that you are on the list for that section. The president of the poll gives you a pencil and the ballot, which is usually a really huge piece of paper, ridiculous. And you go into the booth, you put your cross or write the name, whatever is required. You carefully fold this gigantic piece of paper, put the paper in the cardboard box, and get your documents back, and that's it. The last time I went a few months ago, it took 7 or 8 minutes in total from the moment I entered to the moment I left. And as I was telling Liz, my parents usually evaluate the situation, and if there are 2 or 3 people waiting to vote, they just come back home and come back later, because that's just unacceptable to have to wait in line.
Wow.
And I know it's very different in the United States.
It can be different in the United States. From my experience, you know, and I think this is a problem in America in general, but I didn't vote until 2008, where I would have been, sorry, never do math in public, but I would have been in my early 30s. So, and I did vote in person at that time. They do like local churches and local schools. So I was fairly lucky to walk around the corner to a church and there it was. But I understand in some places it's very different. You know, it's different state by state, county by county. It would be a very easy Google search to see what's happening in some counties in Texas this year, where, you know, one polling location for far too large an area. So yeah, I've voted in person maybe once or twice. And, you know, after that, I discovered the mail-in voting, which has been my preferred method for a very long time. So Luna, have you ever done mail-in voting?
No, and that's a controversial
And does anybody
point.
do that?
Yeah, that's very controversial in Italy. Every election, there's a debate about it, because yes, mail-in voting exists just for Italians that do not live in Italy. So they live abroad, they receive an envelope and they fill in their ballot, they mail the ballot back, and that's it. But there's no way for people temporarily residing abroad or just in a different city from where they're from to vote in any way. There's no vote by proxy, there's no vote absentee, there's no solution for people just like me. When I was living in the United States temporarily, I should have taken a flight back and spent like 24 hours on a plane to go back and vote, which is ridiculous in itself. But I think the logic behind it is that it would be too much of an investment politically and economically to bother making that possible for a wider population. It's just not worth it, I think, for the politicians in charge.
And so what's the experience in the UK? Yeah, do you vote in person or by mail? Is that an option?
Yeah, both of those are options, and voting by proxy is an option as well. I think the first time I voted by mail was when I moved here, because I live in Italy now, and it all felt very familiar to it's the same sheet and relatively simple experience. So our kind of voting in person system is very similar to what Luna's just explained. I think the only main difference is that we don't have to take any form of ID. I'm like 99% sure I'm right in saying that, because it surprises me every time. I always go with like the kind of, they send you like a reminder, you're registered to vote here on this date, with a little map. And they say, you don't need to take this along. I always take it along with me, because I'm always like, I feel like I need an appointment letter. But you just rock up to the desk and give them your name, and they kind of cross you out with a pencil. And it feels very, like it does not feel official enough to me. It feels very kind of cutesy. You're in a little library and there's someone who's just like, yeah, sure, go make this important decision. I voted by proxy, as in I've been the proxy voter for someone else. I don't know if that's the right way to say that, but that's
somebody who could not physically go to the poll.
Yeah, they weren't there on the day, and I don't think they registered to vote by mail in time. And we were in the same constituency, so they asked me to do it. Voting by proxy seems a little bit challenging, just because you need someone who's available on the day who was registered to vote in the same constituency as you are. So when I lived in London, there's 73 different constituencies, so the chances of your friend living in the exact same one as you isn't necessarily that high. So that's a little bit more challenging, like for my personal experience. But yeah, I didn't realise that wasn't the case in Italy. That feels quite like culturally on point.
From what you know of how things work in Italy.
Yeah, kind of the assumption that people would be there, you know, why would you leave? There's that kind of
what kind of underlying to do.
Yeah.
You know, the idea of mail-in voting for me, I mentioned that is my preferred way to do it. And I think it's for a reason that you might not expect. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. I prefer mail-in voting because they send you the ballot, they send you a booklet, here are the candidates, here are the points, here's general summaries of what they stand for. I also have my computer right there and I can do research. So I'm not standing in a booth with these questions in front of me and not knowing how to answer them. I have weeks. I can take all the time I want to sit down and research them. Now, certainly you can and probably should do that before going to the polls anyway. So that's why I prefer and have preferred mail-in voting for a long time. So I'm curious, do you sit down and spend some time researching before heading to the polls? Are there, things on the ballot that I'm just going to skip this one because I don't have an opinion, but I go to this one because I do have an opinion? How's the research work for you, Liz?
So the research for me tends to be a kind of strategic research. So I probably quite predictably, have a certain political leaning, but there's the kind of strategic question of within my constituency, who's got the best chances? Like, where is my vote best spent? We have a first past the poll system for UK general elections. So our parliament is made up not of the proportion of the overall votes, but who wins the seat in everyone's individual constituency. So my MP can win on a 44% majority or a 66% majority. It makes no difference. So my voting decision is admittedly less about the individual MP, typically, because and the proportion of time that MPs spend on local affairs is quite minimal. So it tends to be more about a kind of leaning towards a particular party or policy area, and then trying to make a decision about, okay, based on this constituency, based on the historical votes, what's the most sensible decision? When I voted by mail the last time, though, I was just reflecting on what you said. I did not feel like spending any time. Because I was concerned about how quickly I needed to turn it around and get it back for it to be counted. So my kind of voting experience was like, I opened it, I did it, I put it in the thing, I sent it off, like just as though I'd been there on the day.
Can you clarify a detail for people who may not know? Can you tell us first, very briefly, what MP is? And I also want to frame it around, let's say, for example, if I were voting for a member of Congress, generally there's a Republican candidate and a Democrat candidate, and maybe some third-party candidates that mathematically have no chance. So it's generally Republican or Democrat. So you said 40%, 44% majority. How many candidates for an MP are there in any given election?
So an MP is a member of Parliament. Our Parliament is made up of two houses, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And our members of Parliament are the House of Commons. So they're the ones who are elected by us, the citizens. And within a constituency, I don't think there's a limit to how many people can stand. You would typically have at least 5, I would say, but often many more. So we have...
well, you say 5. I'm not so much curious as like how many can be in the election, because we can have infinite number in the election. How many are legitimate, mathematical, they could possibly win? Is it as many as 4 or 5?
I would say a max it's 4. So you've got the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, which is almost not quite Republican Democrat equivalent. But then we have a third party that up until the kind of 2010, they became part of a coalition government, which actually kind of led to their demise. But up until that point, they were a very kind of legitimate third competitor, not in the question of who actually becomes the government, but for an individual member of Parliament, like there was a healthy number of Liberal Democrats, and then we have a Green Party, a Scottish National Party, some other parties where there's like fairly high likelihood that they would win an individual seat, especially in Scotland, obviously, for the Scottish National Party.
So you could have a contest where there's 5 candidates in general for one MP seat, and 44% is an overwhelming majority.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, absolutely. But you could even have it that, one got 44 and one got 42, and that's irrelevant. The 40%, there's 42% of the vote don't count for anything.
Mm-hmm.
So you just have to win the majority share of that specific seat.
So Luna, we should probably back up to talking, we were talking about mail-in voting. So tell me about mail-in voting in Italy. And I think you might be able to contextualize that a little bit with what we were talking about. It's like, how many candidates are there for one individual seat as well?
Well, it really depends a lot on the election. So first of all, one thing that is very different from the United States, we don't have all the referendums. So we don't vote for sheriff or judges or anything like that. If we have a referendum, it's usually a separate vote, like a separate election.
Different day.
Yeah, different day, different organization. In this case, for example, 2 months ago, we voted also for a referendum. And so there was also that ballot, but that's very unlikely. How many candidates? Well, the last time for the regional governor, we had 9 candidates, and there were 2 that were most likely. So we have a lot of small parties that get together and form a coalition usually. So we have generally a right-wing coalition, a left-wing coalition, and then a satellite of different little parties that don't count really for the election. And I don't know exactly how it works in terms of percentages, numbers, and the system. It's overly complicated and nobody really understands it. But for example, when we vote for local elections, you generally have to gain at least 51% of the vote, or you go to a second round, and with the 2 candidates that got the higher percentages, and they challenge each other, and then whoever has 51% becomes mayor or governor or local official. For national elections, it's I don't do any research because it's just a matter of, as Liz was saying, like where you're leaning politically and what's the line of thought of the major party, basically, as your fault.
And I think that might also be the difference between what you said, where when you go to vote, you're voting for a much smaller list of things what I'm voting for. There's, in this particular general election, of course, there's the president. I know where I'm going months in advance. You know, Congress or Senate, generally I'm going to know. But then when it gets to judges, when it gets to propositions, when it gets into smaller granular things, I feel like I need time to research it.
Mm-hmm. And you have to vote, you're voting for all of those things on one day.
Yes, but you don't have to. You can skip anything that you don't want to vote on. You know, so for, you know, city council, it was, I think, something like 12 candidates, and you had to pick 3 or 4. And it, you know, just pick your 4 most favorites, you know, and I had to do quite a bit of research. And they don't have information as readily available as the larger offices, for sure.
Of course, yeah.
So as a normal citizen of your country, do you, Luna, work in the polls? Who works the polls? Is it somebody like you? Have you personally done it?
So I have never worked the polls, and I hope the statute of limitations has expired about that, because it works very similarly to the jury duty in America. So you apply to work at the polls, and you apply for your local poll, of course.
You apply because you want to?
Yes, and because you have free time and so on. And I did that over 10 years ago, 15 years ago maybe. And they didn't contact me for the first election that was coming up, but they did contact me for the following election. And I had a Hanson concert to go to, so I kind of didn't reply to that letter. But they, at the time at least, they sent you a letter, and then you had to contact the polls, and you would go there and I guess get the training and start working there. And every time, at least locally here in Venice, there's a big controversy because a lot of poll workers are the workers and employees of the local transport company. So there's transportation disruptions, and there are a lot of unemployed people who apply that never get called because they keep calling the same people. which is understandable because once you've trained those people, they know how it works. So it makes sense to have the same people, but at the same time, it's a problem at every election. There are minimum of 4 and up to 6 or 7 people working at the same section, so in the same classroom, because one for the men, one for the women, one is the president, and then other people replace them at some point during the day to give them the chance to go to the restroom or have a snack or something like that. And they get quite a bit of money. It's a grueling job, very long hours from Saturday to the Tuesday, I guess, but it pays quite well.
Okay. I'd never considered doing it until this year. And it turned out, I wanted to do it, so I pursued it. And it turned out where I live in California, it was completely unnecessary because by that time, they'd already filled all the positions. I don't know how true this is, but generally it's understood that retired people work the polls. They've got much more free time, so they'll take a couple of days and they get paid for it. But with COVID, it was much less secure for older people to be doing that. So there was this push, we need people to do it. There was kind of a hilarious scenario where I did a Google search to find the phone number and accidentally called a city in another state because they had the same name as the city where I live in California. And they asked me, are you registered as Republican or Democrat? Because they needed, I can't remember which one it was, but they needed people of one party because they had way too many people of the other party and they needed to keep a balance. But by the time I talked to where I live here in California, they said, we have so many people. And I thought, great, I've got a full-time job. I'll just keep doing my full-time job and not take a day off. So how does it work in UK? Have you ever done it, Liz?
I've never done it, and I never thought about doing it until Luna sent me this question. So I did a little Google, and yeah, similarly, it seems like a bit of a slog. It's in the UK. It's one day, so it's 6:30 a.m. until 10:30 that night without any breaks. And I read that there can be a minimum of 2 people in one polling station. So I have no idea what they do for cover. It seemed like they were just accepting applications at any point, and you kind of join a database, and then presumably maybe, I don't know whether you get interviewed or you just get kind of requested and see if you're available. Seemed like their training was online, so I don't imagine it's particularly easy. I can imagine a slightly frantic day for a first-time poll station worker. I hadn't realised the idea of, that's a really good point about which party you registered with. I don't know if that enters into it in the UK or not, but the idea of registering to parties, I think, is kind of less popular in the UK than it might be in the States.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that they didn't ask, are you libertarian? Like, they don't have to have an equal number of libertarian or Green Party candidates. They were only concerned about Republican or Democrat, which lends more to that idea that, generally speaking, they're the ones likely to win an election. But in Italy, in the UK, but I think more so in Italy, where there are many more parties and it's more in flux, I think it'll be very hard, if not impossible, to get any sort of balanced representation there.
Yeah, and also we have the poll watchers, I guess you could call them. Like, we have representatives, authorized representatives from different parties that can drop in and just oversee the procedures. And we always have at least 2 policemen in every poll station. So that in case there's something going on that is sketchy or anything, they can just call the policeman and have him intervene. So, but
it's a big draw on services then. You've got all of the transport staff running the polls. The police are there too. Like, that's a big drain from every single poll station.
Yeah.
So a big subject of debate in the United States this year, specifically because of COVID, is, well, we have a lot of people voting early mail-in, early voting processes. And the question becomes, when will those votes be counted? When will we have the final results? In the United States, typically we have the result of an election that night or early the next morning. That is more traditional. That's more of an expectation, because we have literally weeks and months to do that count and certify it properly. But generally, once you hit that, 270 electoral votes, it's clear. So we're kind of bracing ourselves for this idea where people have generally expect to have results the same night, but this year we won't have that. And probably a lot of gross political maneuvering that will explode from that. So in the UK, do you generally have results the same night? How does that typically work? And do you expect anything different this year?
So our kind of typical thing is, again, the election night is this decision of do you stay up? Do you wake up in the morning and find it? When do you check your phone? So yeah, the kind of traditionally for me, it's always been that night, early the next morning. A couple of times in the last 10 years, that has not been the case because we've had what is called a hung parliament, where there isn't a majority in the House of Commons. No party has got a kind of overwhelming majority. So making it very difficult to form a government that's going to be able to get anything done. So I think it was 2010 and 2015 that we had this kind of hung parliament result, which then meant, I think the first time it was a delay of kind of a week whilst they did some negotiations on which coalition to form. And the second time, I think it might have been up to a month. And quite a few things happened within that month of negotiating and trying to find a suitable deal. And in the meantime, there's all kind of headlines about the potential deals and the history of that party or this party. So it's become a more familiar experience to be prolonged.
And I think there's something that should be clarified for an American audience. You do not go to a poll and check a box to vote for prime minister. You vote for your members of parliament who then form coalitions, who then later down the line decide who will lead their party and become the prime minister, etc. So when you talk about forming a government, you're waiting for those results.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're voting, by the time you vote who the leader of that party is, who the hypothetical prime minister would be. So in a very simplistic way, if you're voting for your local Labour candidate, you're really voting in your head for that person to be the prime minister. Okay. So we still do have our fair share of the kind of personality politics of that kind of leader. That still is a huge part of it. But that person is an MP themselves, so they are elected directly in their own constituency. But most people aren't voting for that person. Technically, their vote is for an MP who will have a seat in Parliament, and then the party with the majority number of seats will form government, and therefore that person will become prime minister. I hope that makes sense.
I think that makes sense. And so do you expect anything to be different this year as far as getting those results, specifically because of COVID or in general?
So now you need a really interesting question, which is when is our next election? Because we had our last general election last year. There were meant to be, there were definitely meant to be some elections this year, but I don't know exactly what they were. They could have been council elections. So I don't know what, I really hope we're not talking about COVID next time we have a general election in the UK.
And that shines a light on my American-centric point of view. We are so absorbed with our election right now. I don't know why it didn't occur to me that you're not in the middle of the election as well. That's such a stupid perspective for me to have. Yeah.
I mean, I also feel like I think most people feel like everyone's talking about the election tomorrow without, we don't need to say that it's the American election. I think everyone feels that.
So Luna, and you're not in the middle of an election now.
No, and we're really never in the middle of an election. Like, it's not as eventful as it is in the United States, just because we have one every year, basically. And the experience
and it's not on such a set schedule as what we have.
No, absolutely, and there's a lot of strategy about that as well, because being on a weekend, nobody wants to get to an election in the middle of summer because people are out and about and going to the beach, and politicians are encouraging people to go to the beach if they don't want them to vote, all kinds of stuff. So no, we don't have a specific period to vote, and we don't feel that importance of the event as you would have in the United States, because many times, as in the UK, we end up with hung parliaments, we end up with coalitions that change and new people that are elected prime minister without even knowing who they were till 5 minutes ago. So yeah, it's not as eventful or as interesting to wait for the results, which we usually get the night of the election or early morning the next day. In the case of the regional elections that we had in September, we had the results the same day, and our governor was re-elected with 78% of the votes, so there was no need to question the results either. So, and one important difference that I think is from the United States, we have only paper ballot, and they are counted by hand. I don't know at what point they are actually inserted into some computer system, but it's all very manual and analogic. There's no internet connection involved in the voting process. So, and I know that's very different in the United States, even from state to state.
Certainly, and I was having a conversation with my mother recently where she said, "Why doesn't this all just happen online?" And the only response I can give is, there's an answer to that question. It seems like a reasonable protest to have, but I can't sit here and answer that question because it is a question that demands a significant amount of research and understanding. But I think it is a question of security. And ultimately, if there is some question, to be able to go to a box wherein all of those ballots are sitting there on a piece of paper, I think there's a tremendous value to that. And Liz, is it all paper-based in the UK?
Yeah, it's all paper-based. We can't. I don't know how they process it. I hope they're not just.
There must be some machine to do the counting.
Put something into a computer. Yeah, but like, as in, there's no possibility to vote online. So the voting is all paper-based. Again, I think for security reasons or security concerns, at least. Like, it's a big old debate. And there's Luna was asking me the other day about my how I send my letter, when I send my vote by mail, how do I know that envelope has arrived at the correct address? What happens if I receive my neighbour's voting slip? What are the kind of possibilities there to intercept things and open envelopes and stuff, which is lower scale for sure, but still does raise questions.
And I think that's the question of fraud is an important and interesting one. And there's a lot of debate here in the US about the fraud that could come from mail-in voting. And the numbers are clear. Yes, there is fraud at something at like 0.001% of the voting population. So I think that the whole thing needs to be governed according to, okay, is that a problem and how often is it a problem? Sure, you could get the mail-in ballot for your neighbor and execute some sort of fraud, but how easy is that to do and how often does that happen? And if it happens, more than 1% of the time, then maybe that's the time to address it. But if it's less than a percentage point, then, it's not a problem that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, I think in Italy, the big election fraud controversy every time is that there are criminals paying people to vote in a certain way. And that's why phones should be confiscated as soon as you enter the poll location and given back to you, because that way
the criminal's going to influence them after they've walked in, not before.
They are going to
the answer right in the moment. You'll get a text.
Yeah, they're going to require that you take a photo of your ballot to demonstrate that you voted the way they wanted you to. And there are some people posting their selfies in the ballot, and getting fined for that. But yeah, otherwise, like, the easiest way to influence the Italian vote is definitely through social media. So it's not even worth it to try and disrupt the actual election. They can just
the cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah,
is it worth the cost it would take to?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's a very interesting discussion, and I think it is far too easy to look at the process of an election through the point of view of your own native country. I think it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see the the mistakes that I made even here in this conversation, making assumptions based on the election that I'm currently in. And Luna, you had several questions that you wanted to be addressed in this conversation. I think we got through them. How are you feeling with what we've covered here?
Yeah, it was all very, very interesting, because it's also hard to get that kind of information when you're not actually living and when you're not experiencing it firsthand. And one last thing that I think it's interesting about the Italian elections is that voting is a right, but it's a duty also constitutionally for Italian citizens. And so until 1993, there was an actual register of people who did not turn out to vote in every town. So I think that was very interesting, but I guess it was way too much work to keep that register for every election. And
I was going to ask at the beginning, if you turn up with your little stamp book and there's one missing, do you?
Sometimes I have to say, in that case, sometimes they forgot to stamp it at some elections, so I was very disappointed by that. And so that's not very reliable as a proof of.
I'm always very disappointed when I travel somewhere and they don't stamp my passport. I wanted that stamped.
Exactly. Yeah.
I've only got one stamp, but traveling largely in Europe, stamps that were a completely new concept to me. So consider yourself lucky, Nick, with the stamps that you do get.
Yeah.
Well,
they might start looking at you a little bit differently as you travel around Europe.
My time is up.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you so much for this conversation. And to everybody watching, if you have more questions, just comment below and let us know what you think of our voting system, and go out and vote if you can.
Thanks, guys.